My husband told me I was no longer allowed to use our family credit card, and the strange part was how calmly he said it. There was no shouting, no argument, no warning. He simply explained that from now on, every purchase would need to be approved first. For a few seconds, I thought I had misunderstood him. Then I noticed my mother-in-law, Margaret, sitting at the kitchen table with a satisfied expression. That was when I realized this wasn't just my husband's decision. Her fingerprints were all over it. What neither of them knew was that the credit card they were taking away from me was probably the least important financial thing I controlled. My name is Claire Morgan, and for almost 16 years, I had been the person holding our family's financial life together. I wasn't loud or confrontational. I believed that when you love someone, you don't turn every disagreement into a battle. Daniel and I met when we were 26. He worked for a small engineering company and dreamed of starting his own business. I was building my career in financial consulting. We didn't have much money, but we had plans. We rented a tiny apartment with unreliable heating, shared one old car, and celebrated every small victory. Eventually, our lives became ordinary in the best possible way: school mornings, groceries, birthdays, vacations, mortgage payments, and the expenses of raising a family. Then Daniel's father died. Margaret suddenly found herself alone. We invited her for dinner, helped with paperwork, and checked on her regularly. Eventually Daniel suggested she move in with us. I agreed immediately. She was grieving, and I didn't want her living alone. At first, she seemed grateful to have somewhere to belong. I was wrong. Margaret began making comments about the way I spent money. She questioned expensive groceries, coffee from local shops, clothes for the children, and anything she considered unnecessary. Margaret learned that if she pushed a little, I would stay quiet. So she pushed more. Her comments became opinions about our family decisions. Opinions became advice, and advice started sounding like rules. She questioned the children's schedules, clothes, vacations, groceries, and eventually our finances. One evening, Daniel and I were discussing our monthly budget when Margaret interrupted. She said a wife shouldn't make separate financial decisions because the husband needed to know where every dollar was going. I laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. Daniel didn't correct her. But the comments continued. When I bought Sophie a dress for school, Margaret questioned the price. When Noah needed a laptop, she called it unnecessary. When I booked a family vacation, she said we should save the money instead. Worse, Daniel slowly began agreeing with her. He started asking whether purchases were necessary, questioning grocery receipts, and asking me to explain expenses that had never mattered before. Then one afternoon, I came home early and heard Margaret talking to Daniel in the kitchen. She didn't know I was there. She told him I spent too freely, and that he needed to take control of the household finances before it was too late. I expected Daniel to defend me. Instead, he said maybe she had a point. I stood in the hallway and felt something inside me change. I wasn't angry. I was disappointed. For 16 years, I had trusted my husband to see me as his equal. Now I realized someone else had been slowly changing the way he saw me. Then came the credit card. One afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was calm. He told me the family credit card had been locked. I asked why. He said there had been too many unnecessary purchases, and that we needed a serious conversation about money. Before I could answer, Margaret joined the call. She told me that from now on, I should ask before spending anything. When the call ended, I sat in my car in complete silence. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't call Daniel back. I drove straight to the bank. That was the moment everything changed. The bank manager knew me because I had handled our finances there for years. I explained that I needed to review every account connected to my name. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. My paycheck had been going into our joint account for years. I had also been transferring money from my personal investments into that account whenever our household needed extra cash. I had never mentioned those transfers because I considered them part of being married. I also discovered that I was still listed as a guarantor on several of Daniel's business accounts. I had agreed to those guarantees years earlier, when his company was still growing, because I believed his success was our success. Now I realized how much responsibility I had quietly accepted. I asked the bank to separate my personal accounts from our household finances wherever legally possible. I redirected my paycheck. I stopped the automatic transfers from my investments. I reviewed the business guarantees and began removing myself where the agreements allowed it. I wasn't trying to punish Daniel or destroy his business. I simply stopped volunteering my money to people who had decided I couldn't be trusted with it. When I checked my phone, I had dozens of missed calls from Daniel and several from Margaret. I ignored them and drove home. Daniel was waiting. He looked frightened. He told me the business account was suddenly short. Payroll was approaching. Several payments were pending. He asked what had happened. He stared at me. What personal accounts? That was when I realized he truly had no idea how much of our financial stability had come from me. I went upstairs and brought down a box containing years of financial records. I placed it on the dining table and opened it. Inside were investment statements, tax documents, business records, emergency savings reports, and receipts. I showed him the money I had transferred into the household account during difficult months. I showed him payments I had made when his company was struggling. I showed him emergency expenses I had covered without ever mentioning them. For years, Daniel had believed our life simply worked because his business provided for us. He hadn't realized that I had been quietly protecting the entire system underneath it. The difference was that helping someone and being controlled by someone were not the same thing. Our children had noticed the tension too. Sophie admitted she had heard Margaret criticizing me for spending money on the family. Noah confessed he felt guilty about asking for his laptop because he thought it had caused the argument. Hearing that broke my heart more than anything Daniel had done. I realized the problem had never really been the credit card. It was what our children had learned from watching us. They had started believing that their mother needed permission to spend money she had earned and that their father had the right to control decisions simply because he was the husband. That had to change. That evening, Daniel asked Margaret to stay with his sister for a while. He told her he needed to repair his marriage without outside interference. She was angry, but eventually agreed. Daniel said he had confused control with responsibility. I told him the truth I had been afraid to say for years. I didn't need you to manage me. I needed you to trust me. We eventually agreed that if our marriage was going to survive, things had to change completely. We would have a joint account for shared expenses, but also separate personal accounts. Major financial decisions would be made together. Neither of us would demand permission for ordinary personal purchases. Most importantly, Margaret would no longer have a vote in our marriage. Slowly, things improved. Every Sunday, we reviewed our finances together. Not because one person needed control, but because both of us deserved transparency. We learned how to disagree without turning disagreements into power struggles. Our children noticed the difference. Sophie eventually asked us to help her create a college budget. Noah started asking questions about saving money. They were learning from us again, but this time they were learning something healthier. Margaret eventually apologized and admitted that after losing her husband, she had become afraid of becoming unnecessary. She had mistaken interference for love and control for protection. We established boundaries. She could be part of our family, but she could not run our family. Almost a year after the day Daniel locked my credit card, we celebrated our anniversary. There was no dramatic gesture or expensive gift. We simply returned to the small restaurant where we had celebrated years earlier. During dinner, Daniel reached across the table and held my hand. He told me he finally understood that the strongest thing I had ever given our family wasn't my money. It was my trust. He said he had nearly destroyed that trust because he was afraid of losing control. I told him I hadn't driven to the bank to punish him. I had gone there because I finally understood that protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Our marriage wasn't perfect after that. No marriage is. But it became honest. We stopped pretending that silence meant peace. We stopped confusing love with control. And I stopped believing that being the calm person in the room meant I had to accept everything quietly. Sometimes strength doesn't look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like calmly walking into a bank, protecting what you built, and finally deciding that your dignity matters too. I learned that a family can survive financial problems, disagreements, and years of mistakes. What becomes difficult to survive is losing respect for one another. And sometimes the person who seems the quietest is the person who has been carrying the most all along.